So I'm going to continue discussing the women's suffrage movement as possible research or possible dissertation topic. The women's suffrage movement in the United States. So in this particular search, I looked at the ProQuest Historical Newspapers database, and I found 3 historical newspapers that I thought could be used as sources. The first one is entitled 400,000 Cheer Suffrage March. The second was entitled Women's Suffrage in America, the Movement to Amend the Constitution. And the last was Votes for Women, the Movement in America. The first newspaper article, 400,000 Cheer Suffrage March, was published in the New York Times, November 10th, 1912. And I thought this article was interesting in that it discusses how the suffrage parade in New York in the fall of 1912 was much different than the one in the spring of 1912. The author states that there were some 20,000 women and girls, as well as men and boys, marching in the suffrage parade. He also states, or she, I'm not really sure, there wasn't an author, that it was a wonderful spectacle. And that it was witnessed by a jam-packed crowd of over 400,000, and that the noise was mostly cheering of an admiring sort. Not like the last time. Apparently spring was a very, there was much jeering and pushing and shoving. It wasn't was a very difficult time for that particular parade. Because the police during that time wasn't as organized. The newspaper article said the police had learned their lesson from last spring, and that orders went out from the police headquarters this time to have a sufficient number of men to keep the crowds in check. The article was extremely descriptive. It went on to discuss the parade itself in detail, including the Grand Marshal of the parade, Mrs. Beatrice Hale, riding on a snow-white horse. And it goes on to describe each section of the parade, followed by a section taken from one of the suffragist viewpoints, pictures of the parade, and finally the viewpoint of one of the traffic policemen. Now, I'm sorry, I have to have this on my lap because I broke my ankle. The second newspaper article titled Women's Suffrage in America, the Movement to Amend the Constitution, was published in the Manchester Guardian on September 18, 1918. Now, this is more of a European view on the American suffrage movement. And it discusses the progress that was being made at the time in 1910 or in 1918 in the United States towards the suffrage amendment. The article begins by describing how difficult it is to actually get an amendment through Congress, and that despite how hard it is to get an amendment through, knowing this fact, that women in America still tirelessly worked towards that end, towards the end of an amendment to the Constitution. The article discusses the change from the work on a state-by-state amendment to the U.S. constitutional amendment, which they began to really work towards in 1913. It also discusses the toll that World War I had on the movement, particularly on the state-to-state work of the amendment, with the rejection of women's suffrage in the states of Iowa, South Dakota, and West Virginia in 1916. And that although both parties, both the Republican and Democratic parties, endorsed state-by-state suffrage, neither came out for national suffrage. The final paragraph states that at present, in 1918, the situation is as follows. Women have a voice in the election of about 1/5 of the House of Representatives, more than 1/4 of the Senate, and nearly 2/5 of the Presidential Electoral College. But at the time, they still didn't have the right to vote in a national election. Now, the last newspaper article, Votes for Women, the Movement in America, was published by the Washington Post on April 4th, 1910. This article discussed NASA, the their national convention, and the introduction of a petition that was signed by more than 500,000 men and women for the submission of an amendment giving women the right to vote. Now, the author of the article stated that while the English House of Commons basically compares English suffragettes to American suffragists, the English House of Commons had been terrible to the suffragettes of England. He said the American Congress will be much more polite and courteous, and the American suffragists will be much more gentle and womanly, which I found to be quite interesting considering the militant strategies that were applied by Alice Paul and the NWP just 3 years later after this article was written. And as well as the arrests that of the women, which were ordered by the president and Congress. So I think it was kind of an interesting comparison made by the author. Finally, the author goes on to, in the article, to state that suffrage must be waged on a state-by-state in the states first. He goes on to quote Abigail Adams' reminder to her husband in 1776, and he ends the article by discussing the very first organized convention for women's general rights and suffrage in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. So overall, I thought these were some very interesting newspaper articles. There were a lot of other newspaper articles that I could have used and that were available, but I thought these three were pretty interesting as far as and useful as far as towards my possible dissertation topic.